give me 1 sec, because I always forget to do this.
Okay, so good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Today we have Professor Yu Chen to talk about aberrant semantic categorization, the loss of syntactic facilitation on working memory in psychosis. So Professor Eric is a professor at the Center for Youth Mental Health at the University of Melbourne. He founded the early psychosis service in Hong Kong, and he and his team conducted important research there on relapse prevention and the impact of early intervention on long-term outcomes. He also collaborated extensively with colleagues in the Asian Pacific regions and was the head of the Department of Psychosis in Hong Kong. So he devoted decades of work to language psychosis, especially the semantic aspect of language psychosis. So today we will hear about his speaking and listen to his thoughts. So, okay. Now, Eric, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Louis. Thank you for the kind introduction. And thank you for inviting me to this forum. It's really my great pleasure to share some of the work that me and my team has been doing in relation to language function in psychotic disorders. So as a sort of addition to the introduction, one of the things we have to admit is that language study has been exciting, but it's something that we have been doing on and off over the decades. We could not focus on just doing language in psychosis research, but this is the area that we come back every now and then to actually get some, what did I say, inspiration and creativity into research, a very difficult area. And we, over time, it is still a central area in trying to understand psychosis. So now this evening, I'm going to share with you actually only some of our work in language. We have done some different works on language impact of psychosis on language. So I've chosen for this evening some study that actually span over a few decades and to share with you. So these studies are common in the use of more traditional cognitive psychology methods in trying to understand aspect of language dysfunction. And you will, and hopefully they will still give us some ideas and provoke some discussion about the nature of language disorder in psychosis. So, so this is in two parts. The first part is about semantics, and the second part about syntax. And actually, I chosen these two parts not because they are contradicting coherently, sort of things, but because they look so um, in a way separate from one another. So I wish also to have a discussion about also, where do we think the main problem is, syntax or semantics or both, or are they independently affect, right? So first of all, I like to talk about a series of studies that look at semantic abnormalities and now let me see. Okay, so I would want to start with this joke. If we are getting married, would you give me a ring? So somebody asked, and that is the answer. Sure. What is your number? Now, um, if you find this response funny, you may want to start to ask, why is it funny? Why, similarly structured dialogues or exchanges become funny? Why do we have a humor response to this kind of verbal jokes? Now, it seems that the elicitation of humor in us depends on the first part of the joke setting up a context so that we are expecting something. So there's a prediction, and then the punchline deliver something that is incongruous or different from the expectation. So nowadays we talk about prediction error. So the first part of the information lead us to predict something, and then that what happens is different from what we expect. And that actually, if we go back to the verbal joke, would you give me a ring, and then show what is your number? Now that number would prompt us to search for another context, which is different from what is set up in the original context, married and ring. And when we find this second context, it comes as a resolution of the entire meaning of the whole sentence. And when that resolution is found, then we experience a humor. We feel that this is funny. So verbal jokes appears to follow this kind of structure. In fact, it is a mini experiment of prediction error in the language domain in our brain. And now there has been a number of study of this humor response in psychosis, in schizophrenia over the years, and most of them find that there is a deficit in this response, particularly related to negative symptoms. People are not able to perceive humor as other people would. So, but that failure to perceive humor could be due to a number of different problems along these steps, most including the failure to set up a context and generate expectation, or failure to detect the incongruity and so on. Clinically, we observe from time to time patients in an acute psychotic state that find things funny where we don't find them funny. So it could work the other way as well. That it could be excessive sort of humor response in some clinical. That is far more sort of difficult to elicit experimentally, but that is something that clinicians will be familiar with. So looking at what might be going wrong in terms of the language systems in this kind of phenomena is something that could help us understand some aspect of the disruption in language processes. Now, so this acts as a sort of introduction into what we have been looking at, and that is basically about the extent of the meaning of particular words. And in this particular case, we use a categorization task to look at the extent of activation, semantic activation in particular words. Now, this study, the original study, was actually carried out almost 30 years ago. And when I was training in Cambridge and working with Professor Peter McKenna and Professor Arnold Wilkins in Cambridge. Now, I noticed that Peter might actually have joined us this evening, so it would be really good if we can add something to this when I finish. So that broadening of meaning help us to search for alternative meanings of words, and it basically means that with that incongruity, with that punchline not making sense, it forces us to look for a broader context, and that will involve the additional activation of semantic association relationship, of the works that we have been seeing and could not make sense. So that is the sort of process that the categorization task is looking at. Now, at around the same time, of course, the more often used paradigm to look at semantic association is the semantic priming paradigm, to look at the time it takes for recognitions of words being primed, being facilitated by the previous presentation of a work that is related in meaning, so that it sort of half activate the target works already. So as you probably have reviewed already, the literature on priming has been very extensive. Conclusion is that in some studies, some overactive hyperpriming has been demonstrated, so consistent of a with a process of overactive semantic activation in psychosis. But there are some studies which also show under priming phenomena. So this is to bring to our awareness that with these sort of cognitive paradigms, you get inconsistent and sometimes confusing results. And I think a lot of that probably has to do with the sampling of the patients, whether they are predominantly suffering from psychotic symptoms or cognitive impairment or negative symptoms and so on. Now, so the categorization task is slightly different from the semantic priming task. It is a little bit more intentional. So it basically involves the subject making a categorization decision as to whether a target item, target work, belongs to a particular category. So is this an animal? So is a bird animal, is bacteria animal, and so on. So the subject has to make decision, and he has to respond yes and no to these questions. Now, in cognitive psychology, a lot has been done to probe the how people make categorical decisions. So the first of all is the everyday reality that we actually use categories in everyday thinking and expression. So these are the basic category. You actually use category at a certain common sort of everyday use sort of level of the hierarchy. So groups and categories, you can have hierarchies of increasing sort of details and narrowness. So you can have animals, you can have birds, you have mammals, and so on. So people make this decision in healthy sort of subject. People make this decision according to the degree of resemblance the particular item is to the prototype of that category. So it is, people don't use definition. So this is actually quite interesting. For psychiatrists, for example, when we make diagnosis in psychiatry, what sort of categorization are we using? So the natural sort of categorization is this process of the degree of multidimensional resemblance to the prototype, considering at the same time all the different dimensions. Whereas nowadays, if we are explicitly using the diagnostic system, DSM or ICD, we are really using a definition sort of approach to categorization, which is not a natural thinking process. Okay, so the degree of resemblance to the prototype is also called typicality effect, in that if the item is resemble the prototype very closely, the decision is easy. If the item is more remote, then the decision become more difficult. So this is almost sort of expected. And then there is a in the categorization decision, there's a force relatedness effect, and that is something that is similar in some feature to the category, but is not within the category. There will be some difficulty. Must be more effort to make a decision to say that this is not within the category. So there is some interference of the shared dimension between this sort of item and the prototype. And with this, with both the typicality and the force relatedness effect, we can infer from cognitive response with a sort of control cognitive paradigm, the borderline situation where will be somewhere between a very atypical example and a false an item that is outside the category. I'll give you some examples. So, and the original study was actually 3 decades ago, and then there's a follow-up study also really 10 years, 15 years ago. So this is the original vintage study, which I think is still interesting. This is Professor Wilkins and McKenna and I was the trainee doing this study. So what we did was we look at categories, and I've explained to you how decision making in category membership is by comparison of a particular item with the prototype. And a very typical example, a typical example, borderline example, and then the related but outside the category example, and something which is totally unrelated. So in the actual study, subject will be given a category, and like in this case, example of means of transportation. And then they will be given these items, which they have to decide whether they belongs to the categories. So the items of various degree of resemblance to the prototype of the category. And when making this decision, we actually can also look at this from the point of view of extension and intention. So within the category, the relationship are sometimes called intension in linguistics, whereas outside the category, they are related, but outside examples, they're called extension. Now, the typical sort of so these are some examples. The typical response, we look at reaction time is something like this. The red line represents the typical response of the healthy subjects. So this is decision time of time it takes for making the decision, quickest for the typical example, and then with the atypical item, it will take a little bit longer. And then we look at the related but outside category. Example, it will take a long time, but it will be a little bit shorter than the borderline example. And then lastly, a totally unrelated example would take the least, will again take less time. So you get this sort of inverted V-shaped reaction time pattern. And now when we apply this task to a sample of schizophrenia patients, and these samples are included patients in rehabilitation services, so people with treatment-resistant psychosis, and actually a lot of patients from Professor McKenna's service at the time, with a lot of positive symptoms. So we get the blue line. So there is it seems to be a bit of a loss of the typicality effect, and also a related effect which takes longer. So, so our interpretation of this data is that people actually have with psychosis actually have more difficulty in making the categorization decision, in that they have more difficulty rejecting items that are clearly outside the category for normal people, particularly with the related condition. They are treating this as if they were in the borderline condition of equal difficulties. And then the unrelated decision is a little bit better, but still difficult. Whereas there seems to be a loss of the typicality effect. So based on this, we there is actually this is to explain the typicality effect. The difference between typical and atypical seems to be disrupted, lost in our patients. The borderline effect usually takes the longest for the borderline example, but in psychosis patient that is extended to the related condition. So we interpreted that as patients treating related condition in the same way as borderline condition. So in other words, an extension of the category boundary outwards to include more items. And then lastly, the false relatedness effect is there, but it is more difficult for patients. So this is a sort of result from the original paper. Not only the reaction time, but if we look at the actual decision, categorization decision, there is more inclusion, more decision that indicate the patient thought that particular item were within that category. So both the decision and the reaction time suggested that patients are treating more example as if it is within the borderline and within that category. So that was the original study, and we interpreted that as a sort of expansion of the category boundary outwards, or blurring of the category boundary in our patients. Now, we postulated in the original study that this would be something related to formal thought disorder. We didn't find that. In fact, there was a correlation with delusions rather than thought disorder in the first study. In our second study, I'm going to just talk about a little bit briefly. In Hong Kong, we couldn't find even that relationship. So the relationship with actual clinical symptoms was more inconsistent, and but it was disappointing that it wasn't related to thought disorder for us. Okay, now so let me talk a little bit about the development of that area of research. After that original study, an attempt to replicate the study was carried out by Britta. I don't know whether Britta Alphabet is here. When Britta was in the NIMH, she attempted to replicate that study, but couldn't. So what she found was actually that in her sample of patient, the pattern that the patient exhibited was similar to the control, although they take longer overall. She actually found a intact typicality effect and category boundary effect. So that prompted us to further replicate the study to find out, where the inconsistency might have originated from. So, and by that time, I have moved to work in Hong Kong. So I involved the colleagues in Hong Kong, and we actually carry out this study in first episode patients. So rather than the previous two studies were carried out in chronic patients in Cambridge and in Washington, D.C. And this third study was carried out in Hong Kong and in first episode study patients, and also involve a longitudinal follow-up components. So let me sort of briefly share the results. Basically, we find that in first episode patients, we find the same observation as we made in the original paper, that there is there's an abnormality, the borderline and the related condition. So that the related condition is treated as if it is the borderline condition. Okay, and so actually the typicality effect is more affected in this study rather than the original study. Now, however, the important point is with time, with the treatment of the first episode, after stabilization and in year 1, 2, and 3, we follow up the same group of patients with the same test, and we find that the categorization response actually gradually normalize. So after the first episode, and then with a time, the categorization abnormality normalizes, suggesting that this is a stage-related change rather than a trait related. So that is something which was a little bit unexpected, because most of the cognitive function that has been identified for schizophrenia psychosis has been trait-related. They don't change that much, particularly not with the psychotic stage. In fact, if we want to find a cognitive marker related to the psychotic stage, it has been very difficult to find one. So the categorization response appears to be a stage marker related to psychosis, based on this. It also then may suggest some possibilities of why the two original studies gave inconsistent results. If the categorization abnormality is related to the psychotic state, obviously then it will depend on the particular sample, how much psychosis there is in the sample of chronic patients that have been recruited. So we didn't have a chance to do further studies, but it will be really nice to do imaging studies, for example, on this sample. The relationship with the first episode and the psychosis stage would suggest that this may be something related to dopamine modulation. And there are actually some study in healthy subjects suggesting that dopamine is involved in semantic processing. So linking back to the original, the joke sort of background of this study, that the prediction error involvement in semantic understandings. So there is a possibility that the activation of semantic category is related to dopamine. So it would be really nice to do a study in which we also measure dopamine synthesis capacities, for example, in the same population. So we haven't been able to do that, so that will wait for another group to complete this study. Okay, so this is the semantic study that we've been carrying out over the years, and I will now leave the area to change the topic to talk a little bit about another exploration we have undertaken in the area now of the impact of syntax on, in this case, in working memory in schizophrenia. Okay, so there is no link between the semantic studies and the syntax study. It's just another study that we have been able to carry out, which I feel might be interesting, to this group. Now, So this study focused on working memory. So as we all know, there is consistent sort of reports of working memory deficit in schizophrenia. People basically have shorter working memory spans in verbal working memory. Now, however, the sort of classic working memory paradigm involve non-linguistic, primarily non-linguistic stimulus. So this usually use digits and numbers, deliberately chosen to be non-linguistic stimulus. So despite the working memory is supposed to be covering a phonological and verbal sort of system in the brain. So we thought it might be important especially from a more ecological and evolutionary perspective, that it's very likely that working memory is related to the handling of language information. So we asked the question of, if we look at verbal working memory from a linguistic perspective, whether there are actually some linguistic characteristic or properties that are or incorporated in verbal memory. So we look at the impact of syntax structure on whether it will facilitate working memory. So in healthy subjects, the background is that if you use words as the items to be to be remembered in working memory, then the presence of syntax should would facilitate the working memory. So we asked the question of whether this facilitation effect is also present in patients. Okay, so we designed this paradigm in which, so everything is non-semantic. So there are words, but we make sure that the words does not make sense together. But there are two conditions. In one of the conditions, there is a syntactic structure of noun, verb, noun. So this is English. So noun, verb, noun is following a English syntactic structure. So 6 items of 2 repeats of noun, verb, noun, whereas and another structure would be verb, verb, and noun, 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 verb. So that is non-syntactic structure. So the actual lexical items that has been used are, we make sure there is no semantic relationship between them. So they are all nonsense succession or sequences of words, of lexical items. The difference is there is a syntactic structure in one of them. So example here is monkey, noun, washed, verb, and cloud is noun, and roll, second set, roll each pipe is noun, verb, noun. So the sort of non-syntactic version would be hesitate, verb, read, verb, seashell, noun, news, noun, and lantern, noun, and so on. So we gave this lists in random order to patients and healthy controlled, and basically in a sort of standard working memory paradigm to test the retrieval. Now, this is the effect. So generally, patient did worse as expected in both conditions. But what is interesting is that in the control, as expected, shows a facilitation effect in that they do better in the list that follow the syntactic structure of noun, verb, noun, compared with the list that did not have a syntactic structure. Whereas for patient, there is no difference between these two conditions. So suggesting that the facilitation effect of having syntax in the word list does not help patients to remember more. So this is suggestion that maybe the linguistic elements within the working memory system in patient is particularly affected. So of course, there is a general compromise of the working memory system, but it seems that within there, the linguistic component is particularly affected. So we thought this is an interesting little study that hopefully will stimulate some further study and some further thoughts and ideas. Now, the interesting clinical observation is that it actually was related, the abnormality was related to auditory hallucinations. So once again, it doesn't relate to formal thought disorder. Again, disappointing from the point of view of finding the linguistic sort of underpinning of formal thought disorder, but it's related to hallucination. So I guess this study, as well as the previous semantic study, also help us to or bring us to the awareness that language is not just relevant to the symptom of formal thought disorder, and it may well be important for all the psychotic phenomena as well. Okay, so I think that is all I wish to share with you this evening in terms of presenting some studies, and I would sort of leave the time open for some discussion from the group.
Okay, thank you very much for this wonderful talk. It was very interesting. So now we have time for some questions. You can raise your hands, and well, since I'm the host, I'll take advantage again, and I'll ask the first one. So I was wondering, with your results regarding the improvement with the treatment in the semantic categorization, could you tell us more about the patients? Were they experiencing relapse? Were they in remission? Because you were talking about the time that you show us a graph showing the time after the first time that they have the first episode, right? And then they had some improvement with the medication. So I would like to know a bit more about those patients.
Right. Okay. So this is actually patients that are involved in our longitudinal first episodes of cognition studies. So most of them improve with treatment. Very few patients become treatment resistant from the first episode. And those were 3-year follow-up data, and about, I think at 3 years up, actually relapse happened quite often. About 60% would have experienced one or more relapse. This is a naturalistic study, so some people may have stopped their medication and have relapse. However, the follow-up testings were usually done when patients are not in an acute episode. So in contrast to the first episode, baseline first episode, testing timing. So let me go back. The first assessment was done in the blue line, where the initial were done usually actually not during the very acute psychosis, but when patients are beginning to settle down, but most of them are still within the first episode. Whereas the stabilized year 1, 2, 3 would be patients with less positive symptoms Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Sunny,
So
you
they
have
have relapsed, but they were not tested when during a
yeah.
relapse. Yeah. Hi. Yes.
Hi, I had a somewhat related two-part question, but maybe first, this is really fascinating. The what you showed on the results, both in terms of the syntactic task as well as the semantic categorization task as well. I was wondering, but you mentioned that it was disappointing that it was not related to thought disorder symptoms. I was wondering if you looked at thought disorder symptoms as a single clinical entity, or if you thought about different like dimensions within within thought disorder, as the first part of my question there.
Right. Okay. So yes, we actually look at different aspect of formal thought disorder. It is sort of the assessment of formal thought disorder also evolved with time. In the very first study, if I remember correctly, they were the formal thought disorder measures were actually items from the BPRS in the 90s, so very primitive assessment. And we
Mm,
might have done the thought language and communication scale of Andreessen. Now,
mhm,
subsequently, develop our own measure for formal thought disorder. So there is the CLANG, C-L-A-N-G, CLANG
mhm,
formal thought disorder assessment scale that look at the different psycholinguistic levels. And we would be particularly looking at the sort of semantic loss of semantic association
mhm.
as the primary sort of phenomena in thought disorder. We would try to not to look at the negative formal thought disorder, just the poverty of speech and lack of speech or other sort of less specific formal thought disorder
Yeah,
measures. So yeah, but we couldn't
I
find
couldn't find it.
so,
Uh,
so
yeah,
yeah.
and then more related to this figure, I was wondering also that perhaps there are additional factors at play that obscure the effect when you're looking at between subject differences. But perhaps it would be hard to come up with the right experimental design for it. But I wonder if it might be interesting to look at within subject change similarly in terms of these for thought disorder. So, if one were to imagine a perfect world where you could like you specifically intervene on thought disorder, and so you might find that these tasks reflect within person change in thought disorder specifically. But I think that would be hard to, because we don't have that very targeted type of intervention. I think it might be hard to realize in the real world.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, actually, we have look at. I haven't presented the data here. We have look at the change with time, using the Clank scale,
Yeah,
in a cohort of patients with thought disorder. So that I mean, basically, some of them most of them actually get better with
yeah,
treatment for disorder, the semantic level for disorder. But the more negative kind of for disorder doesn't really get better. That's almost
yeah,
expected. Yeah. But
yeah. But I assume their other sarcosis are also getting better, so it's hard to tease it apart as a specific effect. Yeah.
that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, Lena?
Hi, Eric. Thanks for this excellent talk. I really enjoyed it. It was a nice revisit of many of your historical works. Excellent. Thank you. I have two questions. One on just a comment following up with what Sunny said. It's nice that you brought up Clang scale. I would like to get some more thoughts from you on the compulsion to make a scale like that at the time, and also the fact that I think Tim Crow used your scale for a while in some of his studies as well. what is the thought at the moment of using Clang scale when people are undertaking new studies on thought disorder? What are the pros and cons? So I would like to know your thoughts of that. Secondly, very straightforward question is on the hypothesis that you proposed with working memory being an important component of syntactical deficits. Now, if I remember correctly, Peter is in this call, Peter McKenna. Peter's book put forward more strongly the semantic hypothesis and executive hypothesis, not not really standing working memory as a separate component, but subsuming it under the executive frontal hypothesis. When you think of working memory issues, should we think of it as a separate standalone component that contributes to thought disorder? Or is this a part and parcel of context processing, this executive issues that we see in schizophrenia in general?
Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Lena. So very interesting question of, I think here we are talking about the way I think about this is the impact of different cognitive function domains on a particular symptom or particular uh, 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 cognitive uh, cognitive module or component. So the way I think about it is a component relationship between cognitive function, and that is we try to get at the simplest function, and some of the functions are built up from these simpler functions. So working memory, for example, would in my view, would be a very simple function of just holding some information together for a short period of time. Whereas planning, sorting would be a more complex function. Even categorization would be a more complex function that utilize the basic function like holding information for a short period of time. So try to I try to sort of look at cognitive function in terms of their complexity and whether they can be broken up into component processes. And I think there has been some work in sort of teasing out components. For example, the Wisconsin cut-short test has many, many components, and where if we can identify uh, deficit in a more basic components, I think that is probably a bit more informative than having a deficit in a very complex component, because you don't know within that complex component which process has been going wrong. And using Occam's razor, so if you can explain things in a simpler way, then that is so in that sense, I would have a preference for the simpler sort of cognitive functions and compare with the more. So, but of course, it is more difficult, to try to distill the very pure, simple component of cognition. And so I'd like to also hear Peter's view on this as well. That's what I've been sort of now, the first question about the Clank scale.
Land.
The Clank scale was developed at a time when the only other available scale was the TLC, the thought language and communication scale that Andreessen put together. And there was, I think, within the sense, the negative symptom scales, and the SAPS, the thought disorder components, and they're the same components that have been put together into the thought language and communication scale. Now, the TLC scale was based on some almost like classical descriptive phenomenological sort of description of the classic thought disorder. Some of them, some of them were more corresponding to the original description. Some actually don't correspond that well with the original description. So at that time, the Klang scale was we thought of maybe we can look at the formal thought disorder phenomena from the perspective of what we knew in the different level of linguistic speech production. So we are talking about the syntactic level, the semantic level, the phonological level, and in each level there can be deficit or failure to form the right sort of the user right sort of principles or factors that normal people uses, or it could be an excessive use. For example, in phonological level, excessive phonology would lead to clang association, actually. So we are trying to tease out where along the different level that psycholinguistics sort of outline for us for the language production. We're trying to identify where the abnormality for a particular patient mostly lies. So that is a clang scale. I still think it is pragmatic and it gives a good description of the phenomena and into these different linguistic levels. So you can look at things like, for example, are there syntax abnormality in the formal thought disorder? So when syntax is affected, the sort of phenomenological description would be word salad. It would be but word salad would be a very extreme form of syntax disruption. And there is nothing in between in the traditional form of thought disorder, sort of a description. So you go straight to word salad if there is syntax. So I guess using the Clang scale, for example, it allows you to be a little bit more sort of graded in terms of abnormality in the different sections. Yeah. So it is not very easy to use, though. I have to say that the rater is a clinician rater scale. The rater has to be very clear about what he is looking at. Yeah.
Yeah, that can be said about most thought disorder scales we have.
That's right.
Okay. Does anyone else has any other questions, comments? Anyone else wants to say something? Sunny?
Well,
I was just gonna, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, you carry on. No.
Please. I think you were invited. I was just
Okay,
adding
yeah,
something.
well, having been invited to comment, I suppose I should try. Yes,
Hi,
the Clang,
yes.
yeah, hi, the Clang scale, first of all, is a very nice scale, which never found its place in the assessment of thought disorder. My personal view is the TLC scale needs updating and radically. Some things like alogia and positive content of speech probably ought to be jettisoned, in my view. This is a personal view, so I don't expect many people to agree with me. But really, it was always the red herring, in my view. I can to include negative formal thought disorder items in the TLC. I can understand why she did it historically, because it was purely descriptive, but it's just muddied the waters, I would say, over the years. So it would be much better to focus on what in the Andreasen scale is positive formal thought disorder. And if it was to undergo a revision, it might be better to incorporate some items from the Clang, or to think again about about what items are important. But that would be a big initiative. With respect to working memory, formal thought disorder, this theory has a history, but sadly a short history. It came into vogue, God knows, in the early 1990s, mid-1990s, and there were a few studies looking at working memory in relation to thought disorder, and I think there was a bit of theoretical exploration, but then people lost interest. So I don't know whether it's a valid theory or not. Maybe it is, but it's kind of lost out to disexecutive and dissemantic theories over the years. But I mean, in your theory, your study of serial recall, there was no relationship with thought disorder, but there was a relationship with auditory hallucinations. Again, that's something that really ought to be replicated, because if so, that's quite an important finding. As I think you touched on in your talk, Eric, no one has ever successfully related reality distortion, that is delusions or hallucinations or both, to a cognitive variable. So if you found something positive there, if there's a signal there, it really ought to be looked into. As an aside to that, if you look at the symptom capture studies of auditory hallucinations, the modal finding is Broca's area, and Broca's area is involved in phonological encoding and, as I recall, in short-term memory. So there's a kind of a connection there, which could possibly lead somewhere.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks. Yes, indeed. So yeah, hopefully some younger investigator from this group will be able to follow up these
Well,
ideas.
we'll try and as we're interested in auditory hallucinations, we could try and interest one of our younger investigators in your study.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in. I wanted to comment on some things that we're doing in discourse in this consortium related to these topics, and especially in terms of the scales. So Frederica Stein and I co-lead a working group for clinical harmonization, and we actually have a couple of ongoing projects that are related to this area. So Alban actually has one project where he's looking at semantic analysis of the descriptions of thought disorder phenomenology, and like trying to distill it from that perspective and understand the dimensions and where the phenomenology from a descriptive perspective, from a clinical understanding perspective, come together and diverge. Sorry, was that fair, Alvin? I tried to distill it. Yeah, okay. And we also have Sri Raj from the NIMHN. Sorry, I forgot the acronym in India, and he's working on a review and a distillation in terms of from matching items with clinical expertise and expert understanding of these items. And then finally, Frederica and I are putting together what we hope to be a large international multilinguistic data-driven approach to try to understand the items and how they come together. So we're doing really well. If anybody wants to join us, we already have nearly 5,000 data points actually of participants who have been rated on one or more thought disorder scales. I think our goal for the data-driven approach is that Frederica and I believe that there are some underlying common dimensions, core dimensions to thought disorder that the various scales are trying to approach in their various ways. And our goal from a clinical harmonization standpoint is to first understand what those underlying dimensions are, and secondly, from a utilitarian perspective, to provide a way to map individual items from individual scales to the underlying common dimensions so that we have a way to collaborate and to understand across data sets. So we would love if you have, if you're willing to contribute completely de-identified thought disorder scale ratings, especially if you have them on more than one scale. It would be wonderful to have that be a part of the effort, but we can talk offline.
Yes, yes. No, that's wonderful effort. Thank you, Sunny. Very ambitious. But I mean that what is needed, some harmonization, some sort of rethinking about what actually how people understand the concept. And actually when the original classic description were described, people have in mind some model of how they look at language and expression. And so for example, one component which I think is fascinating but not quite receive a lot of attention is that we are are we talking about monologue or dialogue? When we talk about language disorganization, usually, clinically, it is a bit of a dialogue, and
Mhm.
uh, but in the analysis, traditional analysis is really primarily monologue analysis, and so this is something that I've been challenging Louis and Wolfram's group to can they do some computational analysis on dialogue, for example. It would
Mhm.
it would think help to enrich the capturing the phenomena. So clinically, I myself remember a case that I have seen and videotape a lot, there is from lack of referential failure and so on. And it turns out that at the end of the day, the patient, thought he was communicating with me through telepathy, that I knew all about those references. And therefore, he didn't need to explicitly spell out, who is who. So what, from a monologue analysis, appears totally disorganized and confused in a speech sort of context can be understood in terms of the what the speaker is expecting the
Mm.
listener to have known already. That sort of theory of
Yeah.
mind dimension. Yeah. So yes,
Yeah.
please. I'd be very, very interested to be involved in and some of these efforts. Yeah,
Yeah. Wonderful.
that's very good.
Okay, does anyone else has a question or comment? We can maybe do one more. If not, it's fine. I think it's very late for Eric. I think that it's actually Saturday, right? In your side of the world. So maybe we can
Yes, I.
leave it here, let you rest. We really appreciate that you share all this perspective with us. It was very, very interesting. Thanks to everyone that participated as well. Very good discussion. And we can call it for today. But before that, I will let you the invite for the next seminar, which it will be on November 28th. Sorry, November 28th. November 28th. And it will be theory-driven analysis of natural language processing measures of thought disorder using generative language modeling from Isaac Fradkin. So I really hope to see you there. And yeah, and that's it for today. So thank you very much to everyone and goodbye.
Thank you, Eric.